The bell above the cafe door jingled, and for a moment, I let myself imagine it was just another ordinary Thursday. I stood by the counter, hands tucked into the pockets of my hoodie, trying not to notice her. She was already there, mid-40s maybe, leaning against the table by the window with that quiet kind of poise that made people look without really realizing it. I'd seen her before, a dozen mornings, maybe, and somehow I remembered the exact way she stirred her coffee, the little crease she made in her forehead when she read the newspaper. "Latte," I said, trying to sound casual, even though my words came out like a pause, a half-breath. She glanced at me, just a flicker of recognition, and I felt it somewhere in my chest. Not exactly electricity, but the kind of pull that makes you want to linger longer than you should. I turned toward the window, folding a napkin in my hands, careful not to let my eyes wander too obviously. She smiled at something in the paper, but not at me, and still, I found myself counting the tiny gestures, the way her hand brushed her hair back, the slight twitch of her lips as she sipped the coffee. It was ordinary, and that made it dangerous. The barista called my name, and I grabbed the cup, almost forgetting the warmth in my hands was hers first. I carried it over to the empty stool across from her, unsure if I should ask if I could join. "Is this seat taken?" I asked, and my voice caught a little. She looked up slowly, eyes narrowing for just a fraction, then softened. "No," she said, and her tone didn't have the usual politeness. It had a weight to it, like she was considering whether letting me sit down would be a mistake. I sat, careful not to crowd her, and noticed she had a thermos beside her cup. Maybe she brought coffee from home. Maybe she didn't. I didn't need to know. I only watched, tracing the edges of her hands as they hovered over the cup, almost absent-mindedly. We didn't talk at first. I sipped my latte, trying to ignore the awkward hum of the espresso machine, and she tapped a pen against the table. A tiny rhythm. I realized I could hear the sound over everything else, over the quiet chatter, over the rain starting against the window. "You always sit here?" I asked, barely above a murmur. Her eyes flicked to mine, then back down at the newspaper. "Most mornings. It's quiet." "Yeah," I said, and my fingers drummed lightly against the cup. I wanted to say more, wanted to bridge the gap with a joke or some clever comment, but the words didn't come. Instead, we shared a silence that somehow felt less lonely than the noises around us. She laughed quietly at something in her paper, a soft sound that lingered, and I realized I remembered the first time she'd smiled at me, just a corner of her mouth, almost imperceptible. I checked my phone without thinking. A message, unfamiliar, flashing on the screen. I hesitated. Should I read it? Ignore it? My thumb hovered. Then I glanced back at her, and in that instant, the world outside the cafe seemed to shrink down to her, the thermos, the rain, and the half-finished coffee between us. I didn't open the message. Not yet. But I felt the shift, subtle and sharp, like a footstep echoing in an empty hallway. Something was coming, something I wasn't ready for. The next Thursday, I found her again in the same corner of the cafe. Rain had softened into a drizzle, and the smell of wet asphalt clung to the glass. She looked up when I walked in, a faint crease in her brow that wasn't irritation, exactly, more like concern. "Hey," I said, sliding onto the stool across from her. "Hey," she replied, and for a beat, neither of us said anything. I could see the delicate weight of her ring, the faint line of a scar on her knuckle. Tiny things I had noticed before, but now they felt intimate. She pushed her coffee toward me. "You take sugar, right?" I nodded, smiling softly. "Yeah. Thanks." A pause stretched, and I realized I didn't know her at all. "Not really." "So, what do you do?" I asked, trying not to sound like a teenager asking her mom's job. She chuckled, low and quiet, shaking her head. "Nothing exciting. I work at a small publishing house. Mostly paperwork and meetings I'd rather skip." Her eyes flicked to the window. "Divorced last year." "That's my exciting story." I felt something shift, not shock, not pity, just awareness. She wasn't just the woman in the cafe. She had lived, made choices, endured. I tucked a loose strand of hair behind my ear nervously. I didn't know. I don't tell that many people, she said. Especially not someone who could be my kid's friend, if you think about it. She laughed softly, a little breathless, like she knew the boundaries we weren't supposed to cross. I stared at my cup, tracing the circle the coffee had left on the saucer. Imagined scenarios flickered, what it would be like to hold her hand, to say things I wasn't supposed to think, the quiet ache of wanting her to notice me the way I noticed her. And yet, I felt the weight of the unsent messages I'd drafted in my head a dozen times, then deleted. She reached for the sugar again, fingers brushing mine just slightly. Nothing happened. I didn't move. The contact lingered in my chest longer than it should have. You know, she said, eyes on her coffee, sometimes I think people spend too much time pretending. It's exhausting. I envy those who just let things be. Yeah, I said softly, and we both let that hang. I imagined her hand in mine again, imagined the quiet of this cafe stretching beyond the rain, stretching into something neither of us dared name. When she stood to leave, she paused, brushing a few crumbs off the table with her fingers. I noticed, more than I should have, the subtle shift of her posture, the careful way she adjusted her bag. Then, as if without thinking, she let her hand linger on the edge of mine for a fraction of a second before stepping away. I didn't say anything. Didn't need to. That moment, her soft touch, so brief and unintentional, said more than words could. And I knew, in a quiet, almost guilty way, that I'd remember it. Not for the touch itself, but for the permission it gave me to feel something I wasn't supposed to. I didn't know why that moment stayed with me, maybe because it felt like someone finally saw me. It was later that week, and the cafe smelled faintly of baked bread and rain-damp coats. I arrived first, as usual, and she was already there, notebook open, pen poised, but her eyes distant. I lingered by the counter, waiting for the courage to ask if I could sit, when her phone buzzed. She glanced at it quickly, then tucked it away, a shadow passing over her expression. I felt it immediately, a subtle wall, like she'd pulled back without saying a word. Hey, I said softly, carrying my cup over. Hey, she replied, a little tighter than before. Her fingers hovered over the pen, and I noticed the way her shoulders stiffened. Something was different. I slid onto the stool, almost afraid to breathe too loudly. You okay? She paused, not looking up. Just, work stuff. I nodded, though the pause stretched too long. The sound of the espresso machine felt louder than usual, almost intrusive. I traced the rim of my cup with my finger, imagining the last time our hands had touched, fleeting, almost accidental, but enough to leave a mark. Then, the door opened, and a man from her office walked in. I hadn't realized she knew anyone here. He waved at her, she waved back. For a moment, her posture relaxed, and I noticed the ease in her laugh, the casual tilt of her head. And then, just as quickly, she tensed again, back into that quiet, cautious shell. I wanted to speak, to reach across the table, but my hand stayed on my cup. I imagined myself saying something, anything, but the words tangled in my throat. Instead, I watched her. She shifted in her seat, pulling her notebook closer. Her pen scribbled furiously, almost like she was trying to anchor herself. I leaned slightly, hoping the gap between us would close without words. Her gaze flicked up, and for a heartbeat, our eyes met, slow, deliberate, fragile. I could feel the pull, the possibility, and I moved a little closer, not thinking, letting the space shrink. Then she pulled back slightly, a half step, a breath between us. Her lips quirked in a dry, self-conscious smile, and she shook her head as if to say, not here, not now. I swallowed, heart hammering, trying to read what she wanted. I wanted to reach anyway, but the hesitation in her eyes held me back. She had drawn the line, and I wasn't supposed to cross it, yet. We sat like that for several minutes, the hum of the cafe and the tapping of her pen filling the silence. I wanted to ask, to confess, to lean in just a little, but I didn't. The near miss lingered, a tension that tasted like both regret and promise. When she finally packed her things, she brushed against my arm, deliberately or not, and I felt a spark in the small friction. I wanted to follow her out, to say something that would make this less ambiguous, but I stayed rooted, watching her disappear into the drizzle. And for the first time, I realized that maybe the danger, the thrill, was in the waiting. It was evening when I found her on the park bench, the sun low and the air damp with the scent of freshly cut grass. I had walked here without thinking, letting the city blur behind me, hoping I might catch her before she left. She was alone, legs crossed, phone in hand, but she wasn't looking at it. Her gaze was distant, fixed somewhere beyond the path, beyond the swing set, beyond me. I hesitated. The bench felt too small for what I wanted to say, too exposed for the quiet confession swirling in my chest. "Hey," I murmured. She looked up slowly, startled, as though she hadn't expected anyone to know she'd come here. "Hey," she said, voice soft, almost fragile. I sat down beside her, careful not to crowd, careful to let the space between us hold the words I couldn't yet say. The park was quiet except for a child's laugh far off and the faint hum of distant traffic. "You're late," she said finally, but not accusingly. "Just observing." I left work early," I stammered, fingers tightening around the strap of my bag. "Thought I might catch you." Her lips twitched, a little smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She looked away, then back, and I felt the pull again, that delicate tension between wanting to step closer and knowing the line I couldn't cross. "I don't know why," I said, voice low, "but I keep thinking about you. More than I probably should." My hands rested on my knees, still. I didn't want to touch her, I just wanted her to know, without shoving the words at her. Her hand twitched at the edge of her coat pocket, fingers brushing something there, maybe a pen, maybe a note. Maybe I should have said something first," she murmured. Pause. "Or maybe I shouldn't have." I wanted to ask what she meant, but the words caught in my throat. The hesitation stretched between us, a fragile wire strung tight. I imagined reaching for her hand, letting her feel my confession in the press of skin, the gentle weight of a touch. But I didn't. Instead, I watched. Her shoulders curved slightly inward, as if shielding herself from something, or maybe me. The sky above was bruised purple, and the shadows pooled around the bench like a secret waiting to be spoken aloud. "You're dangerous," she whispered, almost to herself. Then she looked at me, real eyes, not polite, not guarded, and my heart thudded. And I shouldn't feel this way. But I do. The air between us trembled with something unspoken. Desire, guilt, fear. I felt it all, a tight coil that wouldn't loosen. I opened my mouth. Half a word came out. Then nothing. She glanced at me, soft, fragile, her next breath catching in the cool evening. And I knew, in that brief, suspended moment, that whatever happened next, a confession, a touch, a step too far, would change everything. But for now, the only question was left hanging in the air, unspoken: do we dare? I didn't see her the next Thursday. Or the Thursday after. At first, I told myself she was busy. Maybe work. Maybe something personal. But by the third week, the small rhythm of the cafe, of her presence, felt hollow. My latte tasted flat, the steam rising in lazy spirals that meant nothing. Then, her text came. Short. Curt. Can't meet for a while. Sorry. No explanation. No, everything's okay, or hope to see you soon. Just those words, a line cutting through the thin fabric of hope I'd been holding onto. I stared at the screen for longer than I wanted to admit. My thumb hovered over reply, then withdrew. I imagined all sorts of things, an ex showing up, a phone call she couldn't answer, a child needing her attention. But the reality didn't matter. My imagination didn't care. It twisted through every scenario like smoke in a dark room. The next day, I went to the cafe anyway. The corner she usually occupied was empty. Her thermos wasn't there. She wasn't there. Just the faint imprint of the day she had left behind, in the faint ring of her cup and the notebook she hadn't used. I lingered, hands wrapped around my latte, tracing the steam with my eyes. I caught myself thinking of excuses for her, something to explain the absence without naming the ache it left. But every excuse felt thin, like paper soaked in rain. I passed her desk in my mind repeatedly, imagined her avoiding me, imagined her leaving before I could arrive. And in that imagining, I felt the strange, tight pull of jealousy, though I had no proof of betrayal, no indication that anyone else had stepped into this quiet orbit. Only the absence, only the pause. Days passed. I left messages unsent on my phone, drafted notes I never delivered, and sometimes, late at night, I pictured her walking past the cafe, nodding politely at someone else, my heart jolting in its chest. Then, one morning, a chair sat empty across from me, her usual seat, untouched, as though waiting. I traced the edge with my finger, imagining the weight of her bag, the warmth of her hand brushing the rim of a cup. But she didn't come. I didn't feel heartbroken. I felt paused. Like life forgot to finish the sentence. The cafe hummed around me, orders called, steam rising, the faint scratch of pen on paper from someone else's corner. But the rhythm I'd been leaning on was gone, replaced by a silence that spoke in half words, in what wasn't said, in the empty chair. I folded a napkin, flicking my eyes toward where her hands might have been. I sipped the latte slowly, and each swallow felt like an attempt to swallow time itself. And still, I waited. She appeared at the cafe one late afternoon, the golden light catching the edges of her hair, soft and unplanned. I hadn't expected her. My cup trembled slightly in my hands as I stood, unsure whether to walk toward her or stay rooted. "Hey," she said, voice quieter than I remembered, almost careful. "Hey," I replied, letting the word hover, fragile. We didn't sit at the usual table. She gestured toward a small table by the window, the one where sunlight pooled like a quiet spotlight. I followed, heart ticking too fast, and for the first time in weeks, the silence between us felt like something we could shape, not just endure. She pulled off her coat, smoothing the fabric over her arm, and I noticed the slight tremor in her fingers. Not from cold, I realized, but from holding back. Holding back everything she hadn't said. I didn't mean to disappear, she said finally. Pause. Her gaze drifted to the street outside, to the children passing by, to nothing in particular. I just needed to think. I nodded, letting her words settle. My own thoughts were messy, tangled between longing and guilt, but I didn't try to untangle them aloud. Instead, I slid my cup toward her. "Tea?" I offered, quietly. She smiled, the corners of her lips tugging just slightly, not a full smile, but enough. She accepted, and the faint clink of the cup against the saucer was louder than anything spoken. We sipped, not needing to fill the space with words. And then, as if the pause itself had stretched long enough, she finally looked at me. Eyes steady now, and I felt the weight of months, absence, anticipation, risk, press between us. She began, then stopped, as though the words might undo something delicate. Her fingers hovered over the cup, then retreated. I wanted to tell her everything, that the waiting had hurt, that the empty weeks had left a mark, that I didn't care about the boundaries anymore. But I stayed quiet, letting her choose the moment. Her hand moved, just a fraction, brushing mine on the table. A soft, accidental contact. Enough to make my chest ache, enough to make the decision inevitable. "I don't know what happens now," she whispered. Pause. "But, okay." I nodded, because it was enough. It wasn't a confession of love, not a promise of forever. It was a quiet acknowledgement of the risk, the longing, and the choice to face it together, or at least, to face it honestly. Her fingers lingered on mine for a moment, not pressing, not retreating. Just there. And in that, the months of unsent messages, missed glances, half-said words, all of it felt, held. I smiled softly, almost imperceptibly. "Okay," I said. And that was it. Not a dramatic declaration. Not a climax with fireworks or perfect timing. Just a simple human connection, a soft acknowledgement, a touch that meant more than any word could. For once, the waiting was over. Not everything was resolved, but something real had begun. Weeks passed. Months, maybe. I lost track, because the rhythm of the cafe and the quiet tension between us became its own calendar. We didn't make a grand declaration, didn't need fireworks or perfect timing. Some morning she arrived at 8:47 a.m., the exact minute she said she liked the sun hitting her thermos just right. I'd already be there, black coffee in hand, waiting. The bench in the park still held its memory, the one where we almost spoke too much, almost crossed too many lines. Now, we walked past it sometimes, shoulders brushing, no words necessary. That silence was different. Comfortable. A quiet acknowledgement that we had survived the waiting, the near misses, the small betrayals of fear and hesitation. We learned each other slowly. The tiny gestures, passing the sugar, stealing a sip from each other's cups, holding doors a second too long. She told me about her work, about deadlines she hated, about a novel she couldn't quite finish. I told her about the weird habits I'd never admitted, the moments I carried around in my head like small treasures. There were still pauses, of course. Long silences where the cafe's hum or the tapping rain filled the space between us. But now, they were pauses of ease, not tension. I noticed her fingers lingering on the edge of her cup, and I reached out sometimes, lightly, letting her touch be enough. No dramatic gestures. No overwhelming confessions. Just life, ordinary and intimate. One morning, I arrived early, as usual. The rain had left puddles in the street, the sun just breaking through. Her chair was empty for a moment, and I thought maybe she wouldn't come. Then she appeared, coat dripping, hair tucked behind one ear, eyes soft in the light. "Morning," she said, voice low. No apology, no explanation, just the word carrying everything we hadn't said in months. "Morning," I said, and we sat together. The black coffee steamed between us, the napkin folded precisely as I always did, the world outside soft and distant. I realized then that we had built something fragile and strong at the same time. Something earned, not declared. Every hesitation, every unsent message, every quiet touch, it had brought us here. She laughed softly at a joke I didn't remember making. I noticed the slight tremor in her hand as she reached for her cup. I touched it lightly with mine, and it was enough. And in that moment, I knew, we didn't need perfect endings. We only needed this. Ordinary. Grounded. Warm. I sipped my coffee and watched her smile just a little, the kind of smile that only I would recognize, and thought, yes, this is enough. Did this story stay with you? What kind of quiet, real love stories do you want to hear next?